Really pleased to have all of you here. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. For those I haven't met before, I'm Rebecca Tromble. I'm the director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, or what we call IDDP for short, here at George Washington University. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to today's IDDP Research Spotlight Series presentation, because this is the very first to feature work coming out of IDDP's inaugural Research Fellows program. So today we will welcome Sarah Nguyen, who is a PhD student at the University of Washington's Information School, and Rachel Moran, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public. And the two of them will be speaking with us about their work on the Sending News Back Home project, which seeks to better understand how misinformation is proliferated through social media and how it spreads across diasporic communities in the US and between the US and Vietnam in particular. So Sarah and Rachel, without much further ado, I want to turn things over to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I really look forward to what you're going to share with us.
Sure. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, thanks for the thumbs up. I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Kind of saves us from doing this first slide, but let me move on. And Sarah and I can just really briefly introduce ourselves. Sarah, if you want to go up first.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And thank you, Rebecca, for the kind intro. So hi, everyone. It's good to meet you and re-meet some of you again. Like Rebecca had said, I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington's Information School, and I've been working with CIP around misinformation around COVID, particularly around the masks conversation on Twitter, but then also been lucky enough to start up this project with Rachel around Vietnamese misinformation.
Yeah, and I'm Rachel. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Informed Public, and I mostly study trust and how people build trust and distrust in information and how trust is implicated in the spread of mis and disinformation. But yeah, we're here to talk to you today about a project that Sarah and I started about a year ago now, that has been ongoing for a while, that is looking at the spread and the impact of misinformation in Vietnamese communities in the US and the kind of diasporic link of how misinformation crosses boundaries thanks to social media. And we obviously really want to thank you here at the IDDP for your support for this project and for your own influential work on misinformation. That is such a sort of grounding for us to help build this project up from the base up. And we're really fortunate to be able to speak with you here today. We've been trying to host conversations with people across our sister centers in the Night Foundation. We've been working with Rachel Koo at CTAP on a project that tries to challenge some of the Anglocentricity of misinformation studies and looks at misinformation beyond English language contexts. So hopefully this will be the start of many conversations we can all be having, and definitely check out their project at CTAP as well if this is a topic that you're interested in. So we'll just start with a little bit of background of the project. Oh, I should mention as well, oh, they just said in the chat that feel free to ask questions in the chat while we talk. Just close the little chat thing. And we'll try and answer them as we go, or we can answer them at the end. So about a year ago when I joined the Center for Informed Public, we started a big project called the Election Integrity Partnership, which was a kind of cross-discipline, cross-institutional rapid research attempt to sort of capture all of the misinformation that was spreading around voting procedures for the election. And it was a fantastic project, but we had quite a blind spot when it came to misinformation that was spreading that was not in English. As we know, there was a lot of misinformation that spread in Spanish that was particularly targeted at Latino communities in attempts to sort of sway their votes around the presidential election and other elections that were happening in November. And one of the things that we found when we were tracking the flow of misinformation, particularly using tools like CrowdTankle or taking or looking into Twitter or YouTube, was the prevalence of misinformation in Vietnamese. And one of the things that kind of struck both Sarah and I was that there were attempts by the platform, as you all know, to flag posts that contained or might contain misinformation around voting procedures. So they would have the little message at the bottom on Facebook that said, you know, Joe Biden has been declared winner of the election, or, you know, voting by mail is safe and secure. Click on this link to go to the Facebook Integrity Center to read more about it. But posts in Vietnamese were overwhelmingly just not flagged at all, even if they were about the same sort of misinformation narratives that were proliferating in English. And even on the kind of small occasions that we did see these flags, they were flagged in English and directed to English language resources, which meant if you were predominantly a Vietnamese speaker, that is just completely lost on you. It's not stopping the spread or the impact of misinformation. And so we kind of felt like there was this extreme proliferation of misinformation Vietnamese that was flying somewhat under the radar. And we decided that it was kind of time to sort of work with community organizations to try and do something about it. Sarah, I can pass over to you.
Can you hear me now? Great. So kind of going off on the idea of these more engaging with community organizations is also seeing that within the research, in academic research of misinformation, as well as just news media, is the lack of collaboration with these community organizations, particularly the lack of focus of non-English language misinformation. So this attention, we don't think is just confined to the platforms themselves. It's just within the literature that we see around misinformation, focusing specifically on English-speaking populations and universalizing them. And while we see this as a number of important studies coming out of different countries that examine different language contexts, there's a persistent lack of research attention on immigrant and language isolated populations. This means that we have little understanding of how misinformation narratives flow within immigrant communities and across diasporas, and the impact of misinformation has on historically underrepresented communities. This is particularly prevalent because a lot of the times when they do come from different contexts, we find that within the academic discussions, these are brought under the rug and not really taken seriously. So fortunately, academics can learn from community organizations who are tackling misinformation on the ground. And this is basically where we started. We ended up partnering with organizations like Viet Fact Check and The Interpreter, who are two mostly online-based volunteer-run organizations who work to translate and fact check from English to Vietnamese and vice versa. And this is in their efforts to counter the spread of misinformation within their communities, particularly the Vietnamese American communities. So our early conversations with these organizers and activists highlighted a number of avenues that required further research, including highlighting prevalence of YouTube personalities, spreading misinformation under the guise of news shows, and the socio-historical complexities of Vietnamese American experiences that make some misinformation narratives more pertinent than others, and then the lack of technological interventions into non-English language misinformation. I'll pass it to you, Rachel.
Before we move on, I'm really terrible at putting things on slides and never explaining what they are. So just on this slide here, we have a couple of sort of examples from our study. At the top is, on the right-hand side, is the website, The Interpreter, and in the kind of bottom in the middle, we see a fact check here from Viet Fact Check. As we said, there are two community organizations who work to, so The Interpreter mostly just translates authoritative news content from English into Vietnamese and hosts it on their website. They do a lot of community work to try and spread that content more widely. Viet Fact Check actually produce fact checks themselves, which they then translate into Vietnamese. And they've been trying to do as well more media literacy and informational literacy series, which we're hoping to partner with them in the future, which look to kind of elevate, when they see it, authoritative Vietnamese content. So in the top left, you'll see a screenshot from YouTube, and this is from an account called King Radio, which is a known sort of personality in the Vietnamese news world. And they run a show, kind of a talking head show that talks about sort of current affairs and daily news. And they have been pinpointed many times for spreading COVID misinformation, election-related misinformation, and just generally having quite like a conservative sort of slant on political news, which would be fine in a kind of very sort of flourishing news ecosystem. But unfortunately, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit later, like as local non-English language news outlets are no longer financially viable and are shutting down, there's not this challenge. So some people only have King Radio, and a lot of people, there's a couple more Reddit posts on here of people talking explicitly about King Radio and the misinformation that is being spread to their family members, because this is the news that they consume every day. And that's kind of one of the driving forces behind organizations like VietFactCheck and the Interpreter, who are working hard to try and counter some of this, or at least provide an alternative. So as we said, we're trying to kind of follow a lot of these threads, and we started by talking to these community organizations. We also put together, and it's growing, a network of Vietnamese American scholars and misinformation scholars we meet and talk through kind of research ideas and challenge sort of like methodological boundaries to try and kind of access communities in different ways to talk about misinformation. And thanks to the support of the IDDP, we've started doing sort of the research that we're going to talk about today, a social media study and some focus groups around this. So here are kind of research questions from our initial study.
Yeah, so when we first started creating the protocols and designing this study, we came up with these 4 research questions. First, we're interested in the narratives that gained significant traction amongst Vietnamese American communities during the 2020 US election. And this is what we'll talk about in a bit, of just how we use that through social media data, such as Facebook and YouTube. Also kind of looking into Telegram as well, since that's where a lot of conversations are happening. So follow-up of knowing these narratives, we'd also like to know how do these narratives impact Vietnamese language fact-checking and other such translation misinformation mitigations, and the spread and acceptance of misinformation. So how does the community react to these narratives, and how do they actually spread throughout each other? A lot of this happens whether at the dinner table or whether it's on their family Telegram group. And then our third research question really looks at the media influencers, kind of like what Rachel was describing earlier, King Radio, or any of these other ones that have these hour-long YouTube news hour shows. And as their media gets pushed and published out to people in Vietnam and within the US and diasporic communities, because they're not only in the US, but also in Canada, in Germany, how does that actually spread, and what information actually stuck with them and got sticky during the election period? We are finding that there are people across the world, not just in Vietnamese American communities, who did follow the US election, and they had their own narratives around it. And then our fourth is trying to figure out, as we work with community organizations like the Interpreter and VietFactCheck, of just how to build a more sustainable and community-driven information infrastructure to counter misinformation within specific marginalized communities. In this case, we're using Vietnamese Americans as a case study, because at this point, VietFactCheck and the Interpreter are all volunteer run. These people all have full-time jobs, while at the same time trying to figure out, like, what does it actually mean to be first, second, third generation immigrant? So we'd like to figure out how can academics and our work itself and all of these different centers can actually push to making this more sustainable work.
And this kind of goes into, we want this project to be really public facing, and we can talk at the end about the many ways in which we're trying to make that happen. But we wanted it to be guided by this commitment to the communities that we were trying to research within. And so we have these objectives that kind of go alongside of our research questions. So some of them kind of more geared towards providing a basis for academic work that isn't just on English-speaking populations within the US. So to do that, we're systematically analyzing the flow of misinformation in Vietnamese to try and kind of produce some academic studies that will hopefully provide a new corpus, like I said, with work that's happening at CTAP and in other places, of misinformation studies that really represent the totality of misinformation rather than the canon, which has been overwhelmingly about white populations. We're collaborating with community organizations like VietFactCheck, we've discussed, and community organizers who work sort of on the ground, which in an era of COVID, on the ground has like weirder meanings, seeing as we're all just on Zoom, but hopefully we'll be able to translate that to some more on the ground efforts when and if we get out of these little Zoom bubbles that we're in. Going into the kind of conversation again, it's understanding the role academic research can play in mitigating the impact of misinformation within marginalized communities to build this more robust sociocultural competency within research and information needs. So trying to tie together misinformation and some of this more volunteer run work in a kind of more sustainable way, as we said. And again, with a commitment to producing community-informed research, one of the reasons why this research is so intensive and also expensive is that we committed to translating everything, whether that's a blog post that we're writing or an informed consent document. So they would be available in Vietnamese and in English, so that we really would be able to reach everyone who exists within the Vietnamese American diaspora that is in the US and North America at the moment. So here are some of our methods.
Yeah, so we'll start off with this first one within our multi-method research project, which is social media analysis, which I think all of us are pretty familiar with as we dive into a lot of social media data. So nothing too crazy new, but we are using Facebook through CrowdTangle and YouTube, which is a lot of actually downloading through YouTube DL. And then through this data, the first part of it is actually we've been looking at Facebook of who are the repeat offenders. Actually, this also shows up in YouTube too, because a lot of the news channels have their own Facebook account too, where a lot of conversations happen. And so within the repeat offenders that we find, these are people who are routinely sharing misinformation. Their accounts come up a lot of replies and discussion commentaries happening around them, which then proliferates the misinformation spreading. So we hope to use that to actually answer our questions, our third research question of how did media influencers spread misinformation, as well as what narratives were actually gained significant traction. And as an example, some of this might be around Biden being a socialist or Biden not actually supporting bringing Vietnamese refugees over, just as a little teaser. And then from the social media data, we also are trying to aggregate a database of conspiracy theories and misinformation during the election period. That was particularly pertinent through the Vietnamese diaspora. And then this is our efforts to actually support the research collective that we're building, so that then there are other researchers who can create a sustainable network of continuing this research. As Rachel and I want to build this out ourselves, we also want to incorporate other people too and really build the community around this, because just two of us is definitely not sustainable. So currently, our Facebook database alone contains over 4,000 Facebook posts and over 500,000 interactions. We also collected videos and their accompanying metadata for 27 YouTube channels with over 10,500 videos total. And these videos have mostly been recommended by community members who have noticed and flagged these videos for problematic information. And a number of these YouTube channels also have more than 100,000 subscribers. So you can imagine the spreads can go pretty widely. So now with all of this data that's actually in Vietnamese, we're working towards working with translators to translate it from Vietnamese to English, and then qualitative coding those so that we can understand who these top performers are who are posting it, and then understand the narratives and gaining traction, and then how they spread across social media platforms. I will say that even though I am a first generation Vietnamese American, we still have to hire translators, just because I only grew up knowing very colloquial Vietnamese. So being able to understand what people are saying around politics and social and historical narratives is really difficult. So that's one of the biggest hurdles that we're going through right now.
So the social media data really allows us to kind of pinpoint both these narratives and also these repeat offenders, the kind of who, the who and the what is being spread. But in order to kind of look more at the impact side of things, we've began hosting focus groups across the summer, and we'll continue hosting them into the fall, where we bring together people who are of a similar age and a similar political leaning into a small group to talk about how they find trustworthy information. And it starts off, we ask questions about how they find trustworthy information, and then it always sort of descends into a conversation about misinformation and what people have been seeing and what's been shared to them and the ways in which it concerns them. And they've been really illuminating, the ones that we've held so far. Interestingly, we found it actually easier is what I'm trying to say, easier to recruit sort of more middle-aged participants. We thought we'd find a really easy time recruiting young people, because a lot of people who work in these organizations like VietFactCheck and Pivot and the Interpreter are themselves fairly young millennial and even Gen Z, but actually we've had a huge response from people in around 55 to sort of 65 who are really concerned about the spread of misinformation and really wanted to talk to us within the kind of confines of this project about that. So we intend on doing some more of these so we can kind of see cross-generationally how concerns are either similar or how they differ. And finally, Sarah, you can take this.
Yeah, so the last part of this project that we're hoping to fulfill with our IDDP funding is that we hope to wrap up our social media analysis and focus groups with more complete and in-depth interviews with activists and media producers within the community. So we're looking to talk to people who run some of the problematic accounts, hopefully that they'll be willing to talk to us, and then have been highlighted as being flagged for problematic information. And then we'd also be able to speak to Vietnamese media and content creators about their experience producing content within a tumultuous media environment, asking them, how do you survey? What type of information do they want to highlight? What stances are important to you? And how do you determine what stances are relevant to actually share? And so really trying to build trust within their workflow, or understanding the workflow, and then trust in bridging the gap between academics and then community organizers as well.
So we have a lot of moving parts to this project, but we really needed to sort of pursue different methods to try and get at sort of both the spread and the impact and see how all of these things interplay. So it's a big undertaking, but we're seeing all these connections kind of come to fruition now that we have sort of early stage data and we've been able to analyze it. So we can talk a little bit now about some of our early findings. We actually wrote a blog post that is available both in English and Vietnamese on the CIP website. I'll put a link in the chat once we've done from this, but so we'll pull a few of findings from there. And since then, we've been doing our focus groups too, so we can talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, so our first kind of preliminary emergent themes have been coming from social media data and then focus groups. And the first one is intergenerational divides. So between generations of Vietnamese peoples, first to second generations of refugee immigrants, grandparents to parents to their children, there's this disconnect of information and understanding around politics and current events. So this means that there's different generations who are exposed to different types of media outlets, not only just the platforms that they use, but then like who's actually publishing the content on there and their information sources, which makes these conversations about news and current affairs even more complicated. So within our focus groups, the community members who were in the age range of 50 to 65-year-olds highlighted how this is not just a divide of young versus old. It's not that simple, but there's a multi-generational divide. So our 50 to 65-year-old cohort spoke extensively about the difficulties of reaching their 75-year-old plus aged parents to counter some of the misinformation they received within their offline community circles. So like within the little Saigons that are around the country. And then the conversations within the younger groups, 20 to 35-year-olds, expressed frustration around speaking with more middle-aged participants. These generational divides are cemented both by differences in technological use, particularly social media, but then also within their different immigration experiences. So how they actually started just interfacing with the US, the politics and the culture, which then goes into our cultural dimensions as a theme. So there's a distinct historical and contextual understanding of meanings of political terms, such as socialist, communist, relationships with China, and just within the general US political infrastructure. And these differences appear within the intergenerational divides. So differences in these understandings allow sticky misinformation narratives around the candidates being socialist or foreign interference in the US election to gain traction. So early analysis of our social media data, for example, highlights increased engagement around misinformation narratives that link explicitly to China or socialism. For example, misinformation around Kamala Harris being a socialist or BLM being a Marxist organization. We're highly engaged on Facebook, YouTube, Telegram, and this suggested Chinese interference in the election through tampering with Dominion voting machines also spread widely. So not just only across just like the technological platforms, but we really want to bring in as a method within misinformation research, these more qualitative cultural dimensions, historical, sociopolitical. And then the third one that I'll go through is the historical trauma. So this also relates to cultural dimensions of these different definitions, but these different definitions are rooted in the trauma that each generation actually experiences. So we're hoping to interrogate this aspect a little bit more because this is something that we find that are coming out of our focus group. So we think it'll really come out of the interviews as well, because these stories of trauma are not lightly brought up in social media data, really. It's when you're in conversation on Twitter and think that someone doesn't want to bring up their entire personal history. It's something that immigrants such as my parents or veterans are not able to consciously bring up. And so this allows more misinformation to spread and become more salient. So we want to stress that this is less about like the victimization of the refugees of war, but more about the power and vulnerability that they have and they want to exercise as becoming like good immigrants or prove their patriotism to the space that they're in. And I'll pass it on to Rachel for the second part.
Yeah, so we have a couple more themes that we find to be coming out of both the social media analysis and some of our early focus groups. One of them is this idea of this power dimension. So Vietnamese Americans are a growing political power within the US, and community members fear that misinformation and distrust in traditional news sources could undermine efforts to increase political involvement and representation. And so just as we're seeing examples of political disinformation targeting minority communities, such as the Latino community being targeted during the US election, there's fear amongst Vietnamese Americans that there's a certain vulnerability to being a growing political power that will make them a target for disinformation that is explicitly aimed at undermining this growing presence that they have in politics and cultural life. One of the other things, and we've talked about translation a little bit, is the issue of language barriers. There was a really great article by a Vox journalist, Terry Nguyen, recently, who's talking about how the language diversity within the AIPI community means that misinformation is really hard to track. And obviously we find that within academia as well. Trying to get resource enough to track misinformation in Vietnamese within America is extremely difficult to do. But we want to be careful when we talk about translation, because it's often seen as like the kind of remedy for everything. If only we could translate authoritative content, we would fix misinformation in other languages. And whilst that is a tremendous thing that we should be doing, and obviously that's what the likes of VietFactCheck and the Interpreter are trying to do, it's not as simple as that. You know, we had many people say in our focus groups and in conversation with us that they'll share a fact check that's being done by VietFactCheck to one of their family members to counter some misinformation that had been shared by them. And their family member will just say, well, you can't trust VietFactCheck, they're a socialist organization. So it's not as simple as just providing someone with information in their native language. There's a lot more going on apart from that. But that does not mean that we shouldn't be translating. So it's a difficult line to talk about. And finally, and we kind of talked about this at the beginning, that social media platforms are really not doing enough to slow the tide of misinformation that's not in English. So the majority of Vietnamese language posts in our data sets, both in YouTube and from Facebook, were not flagged, and they weren't taken down, hence they're still in our data sets even now, so long after the election. And it's not just an issue within the Vietnamese American community, but exposes a lack of investment within technology companies about making content moderation happen that's not in English. And actually, thanks to the work of VietFactCheck and Nick Nguyen at VietFactCheck, YouTube recently announced, and they have been doing, that they would flag COVID misinformation on YouTube videos in Vietnamese with Vietnamese language flags. And while that's a great step forward, it's obviously taken a lot of resource and time to advocate for that to happen. And so more needs to be done. And that's something academia can definitely be involved in to make changes like that happen. We also need a lot more research to the extent to which these flags actually work. Same thing with translation. We can't just assume that if we put this flag on it in Vietnamese, that it's actually going to do anything to disrupt someone's sort of mental thinking when they see this post. So what's next for us? You were on mute, Sarah. Sorry.
Thanks, Rachel. So within our next steps, we still feel like we're in the beginning stage of this project, because we're just trying to carve out what does it actually mean to start doing misinformation research in non-English context. But we do hope to continue building impact for the community and with the community along all stages of the research process. To do this currently, we've made the research a public process through our blog, but also through talking to journalists. So you can see that in the screenshots here, we spoke to Vice about the need for more research in this area. And then I was also lucky enough to appear on Saigon Broadcast Television Network, which is a Vietnamese language news channel based out of LA, to talk about the impact of misinformation in the community. And then we also make all of our data publicly available, which is on OSF. So if you're interested, let us know, we can send you the link. And then we're also, as we mentioned earlier, building a network of researchers to take on the analysis of this data. So this is a really community effort project. And then in terms of academic output, we're currently working with researchers at UNC Center Informed Information Technology and Public Life, CTAP, another sister Knight Foundation Center, so that we can write a paper that challenges the Anglocentricity of misinformation research and call for more expansive methods of researching the spread and impact of problematic information in immigrant and marginalized communities. We're also putting together a couple journal articles based on our social media data so that we can highlight the spread of misinformation narratives around the US presidential election and the role or lack thereof of platform intervention. Rachel?
We're also preparing even more grant applications to try and turn the findings and insights of this project into some community workshops, working with Viet Fact Check to do some more informational literacy programming that can use some of the examples that we found or some of the narratives and the kind of emotional pulls that we're finding to build sort of more robust skills for people to be able to challenge information that they see online. I think that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for your support for this project so far. And we're looking forward to continuing it and hopefully doing some real analysis. We've got so much data to go through.
Thank you, Rachel and Sarah. This was fantastic. You're doing really, really incredible work. I want to open the floor for questions. We didn't get any in the chat while they were presenting. So open the floor to questions. If we have any, we have a lot of black screens. I'm hoping some folks will turn cameras on and engage a bit more. Any questions for Rachel and Sarah? David.
Well, so my screen wasn't black, but I can definitely launch a question here. So I remain really excited about this project. I've been excited about it from the beginning, and I'm glad to see that you guys are starting to make some headway. And you know, I really wanted to sort of dig in a little bit to this notion of translation and some of the failures of translation in terms of understanding misinformation content. Can you talk a little bit more about what are the specific ways in which translation well, let me start by starting a couple of ways. On one hand, machine translation and specific failures associated with machine translation for understanding the spread of misinformation versus translation by people that maybe don't have the colloquial or, you know, the specific area expertise versus people that have both. You know, in other words, people that have the ability to really get into the information. What I'm really trying to get at here is, to what extent, if we want to look beyond the English ecosystem, to what extent do we need to make very large investments into deep area experts? And how do we know, like, specifically, how will we know, like, when we need somebody who's like lives in that community versus somebody who maybe like got a degree in Vietnamese versus something we can just, you know, slam into Google Translate? And where can we draw those lines?
I'll take a stab at this one, and then Rachel, you can pick up where you think. So I think one of the difficult parts that we've been finding within translation, but then also when we get this kind of double checked by community members, is that, like we said earlier, there are intergenerational divides between definitions and languages. So the way that someone actually calls out Ho Chi Minh or the word communist is very different between generations of Vietnamese, from someone who has grown up in Vietnam right now and has gone through an education, a very highly university education in Vietnam, versus someone who actually got an education pre-1975, and then how they refer to Ho Chi Minh. And so when you do that translation and then you send that out into the news so that journalists can share it and publish it, that is also where like where people will stop in their tracks and then kind of determine if they actually trust the news still. So then the way, like Rachel had said earlier, like the way that they might refer to Ho Chi Minh or communism will say that, well, you're coming from a communist perspective, so we don't trust your news anymore. So I think that what makes it even more difficult of doing any sort of automated Google Translate, because it's not direct one-to-one, because what dictionaries are they using and in what context will they be translating between? And then going into at what point, or who do you hire and how much do you invest in these translators, then becomes should we hire both then of types of translators who come from these perspectives, or do we need to come up with like a more canonical standard of actually understanding that? But then that comes with a lot of bias. So there's a lot of different angles to kind of survey that before we actually determine what is the standard translation process.
And we've had that in our focus groups as well. Like, we were lucky enough to work with a graduate student here at UW who is herself from Vietnam. And we had a whole conversation about what accent should she be speaking in, a North Vietnamese accent or a Southern Vietnamese accent. And they come with different, just in the US, different accents come with different associations with them. The same thing happens in Vietnamese, and it changes how you, because it's a tonal language, how you pronounce and the meanings of those words. And that's something that we've sort of had to do by trial and error. It could be very well, that our participants within the focus group didn't care what accent she was speaking in, or it could be that they were, completely thrown off by the fact that she was using a Northern Vietnamese accent, and that might have affected how they answered the questions. And so I don't think there is one perfect answer to this. You have to kind of make mistakes in the research process, and unfortunately, like, research isn't well designed to be able to, accommodate for those mistakes. So that's just like something we're hoping that even within this project to be able to kind of share even the small learnings like that to prompt questioning for other people who are doing these kinds of projects. And on the kind of machine side of things, one of the interesting things that came out of the social media analysis was this kind of pervasive conspiracy theory that, Facebook's translation, like the on Facebook translation, is really, really terrible. Like I have Vietnamese family members who will write a message and then I'll press the translate button and it's just like gobbledygook. It makes no sense. But there was this, because it's so bad, there was a conspiracy theory that like it was purposefully bad so that it was limiting the impact that some of these more conservative leaning Facebook posters could have, because it could only be read by those in Vietnamese. If they tried to translate it, it wouldn't be understood. And they thought that was being purposely done by Facebook. So, I mean, there's a conspiracy theory for everything, but it was interesting that there was in that, because of that technological lack, or our technology is not good enough to do this kind of automated translation just yet, that they saw that as being very intentionally a target. And it was used to sort of validate more conservative like ideas of censorship as well. That was a lot in an answer, but it's a really interesting question. I think translation itself is a fascinating topic. There's a lot within misinformation studies that gets lost in translation, whether it's from visual or from different languages, or your context is key for all of this. And we need a lot more, I think, robust, qualitative, mixed methods work in order to be able to fill the gaps of those contexts and make sense of these translation issues.
I've been sitting here this whole time just thinking, oh my gosh, so many fascinating dimensions to the politics of translation itself. You're really digging into some cool, important, right, fascinating elements of this as you move our attention right into other spaces, other cultures, and so on. Matt Graham, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, I'm Matt Graham. I'm a postdoc at IDDP. Nice to meet you both. I just wanted to piggyback on David's question and you all's excellent answers. I really like this whole project, how deeply you're looking at the contours of this misinformation ecosystem. It strikes me that these hypotheses about translated corrections not being nearly as effective are testable, and I would love to see, down the road, an experimental component of this project that just compared people who got the Google Translate or Facebook Translate version to people who got carefully translated versions. And from the sound of it, you would probably find that there are enormous benefits to investing in better translation.
Yeah, I also wonder if there's also a backfire effect, though, that, careful translation is resource intensive. And so people think, well, who has those resources and why would they be putting it to translate this particular news story? And so that's the problem that, Viet Fact Check are coming up against so much, is like, one, that this label of socialist that is thrust upon them is very easily thrown, but also very impactful. And it means people just don't even read their work if they associate it with a particular ideological leaning. But secondly, that there's always, a questioning of people's intent. And if it is that a translation can only happen through careful, expensive, resource-intensive work, then we're always going to have questions about where are those resources coming from, and why is it that they're particularly interested in this story. Like Viet Fact Checker, our project, based out of Pivot, which is progressive group of younger Vietnamese Americans. And so they are interested in primarily kind of progressive topics. And, you know, if you look at their website, actually, you know, most of it is now about COVID and tackling vaccine hesitancy by translating, you know, fact checks about vaccine misinformation that's going around. Prior to that, it was about the election. But like right now, they're writing a lot about the Governor Newsom's recall in California. And whilst I think that's an excellent thing to be doing because there is a lot of misinformation around this particular recall election, it is highly, you know, contested. You can see why, you know, people might see that as kind of them showing their cards as being a progressive organization, and therefore not in their translation work going to be like this perfectly objective, just straight translation. So maybe there's something to, they might trust Google a little bit more. Maybe they don't trust Google at all. Maybe there is some way of doing some like nameless, faceless, robotic translation that they would trust as being objective. But I think that would be an interesting experiment to pursue.
I agree. I'm excited for when we can continue this project deep into my PhD, where we can do all these different other types of methods.
There's so much, too much for you all to do. I mean, it just speaks to the importance and the value of this work. Are there any other questions? Yes, Matt Hindman this time.
All right, can you hear me? All right, good. I just want to make sure audio is doing okay. Lots of responses here. I really love this work. So let me flag two things that I'd love to get your thoughts on. One of the things that I found most surprising was your discussion about concern among community members and community leaders that belief in conspiracy theories that would spread throughout the community would be a barrier to political power. That I have found a fascinating insight and interesting, especially because that concern does not seem to be mirrored in other demographics. So we certainly see lots of other erstwhile community leaders that view fostering certain types of community of beliefs as political power promoting, not as a barrier to political power. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. The other thing that I think is particularly interesting that ties in with existing scholarship from the Arab world and the Near East and Eastern Europe is the relationship between exposure to authoritarian and totalitarian governments and susceptibility to, or even just attitudes towards rumors and by extension, conspiracy theory. So given the specific context of the Vietnamese experience and especially those, especially immigrants who would be especially likely to leave Vietnam in the 1970s, especially, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that experience might have shaped their relationship with rumors and conspiracy theories.
Speaking to your first, thank you for your questions. Speaking to your first point, I would say that it's mostly, so traditionally, just broadly Asian American Pacific Islander, but also more specifically Vietnamese Americans were not politically active, and that there was a very low amount of people actually registered to vote or have actively voted. Like my mom, she's been in Vietnam, or she's been in the US for 32 years now, and she voted for the first time for Biden's during the 2020 presidential election, which is a big step for just to get her registered and then to vote. So we're thinking that, and then also just like within the anecdotes of what we hear from community members and then within the focus groups is that within this like distrust that is being spread within the misinformation, it deters people from feeling like they have power because they're just like, no one's trustworthy. We already don't believe in politicians. So why should we continue to vote or be politically active? We've gone this far along, being entrepreneurs, having our own mom and pop shops or doing whatever they wanted to do. So what power do we have to actually continue contributing to the, political environment? So I think that that's like one of the biggest ones, which like we're mostly concerned about because this past election, there was such an increase of registered voters within the community. So we're hoping that this does not deter them, knowing that there is this wider spread. Rachel, do you want to say anything before we go into the next question?
I would just add that the Vietnamese Americans, unlike sort of other communities under the umbrella of the AAPI sort of label, are far more conservative leaning, which is something that like took especially the younger Vietnamese Americans that we kind of work with by surprise, that they understood that there is like often a generational divide in their politics between them and their parents, but to see that the community as a whole overall kind of tended towards voting for Republican candidates, despite those candidates not offering policies that were beneficial to their community, was of great concern to them. And they felt like this divide that was happening between sort of younger generations and older generations, more liberal leaning generations and older conservative generations, was not caused by, but extremely exacerbated by a complete separation of media diets, that they were consuming completely different types of news than their parents were or their grandparents are, and there was no way to sit at the dinner table and have a conversation about politics because you are operating in completely different worlds. And so there's a fear that, you know, misinformation, or in this case disinformation, could be quite easily deployed within the community to further that divide, to minimize the kind of growing strength of the kind of liberal younger generation, and to cement instead the kind of old guard republicanism that is increasingly kind of being taken advantage of by these more conservative leaning politicians who use misinformation as an extremely productive tool for support. So there's definitely a concern that you know, they see things changing within their community, within how they're kind of seeing politics and embracing politics and getting politically involved, that might be minimized by misinformation that could either undermine their attempts to sort of more to tend more towards liberal politics, or just sort of strengthen the old status quo, is something that they didn't feel that was that representative of them anymore.
I'll also add just the intergenerationality is so crucial to this demographic as well, just because, especially with Vietnamese immigrants, it's only been 30-ish years since people started coming over here. So the ties to family and ties to motherland are still pretty close and fresh. So, I mean, this is, I feel like, something we're probably going to see decades from now with Afghans. And so it's something that to watch along that. But then on to your second question with authoritarian, I think that one's a great one, just because I think rumors, they're so fascinating, and it's definitely something that I think is going to be coming up when we start doing more focus groups and in-depth interviews where people are willing to be more intimate about it. Just because I know that being in a communist state, there's a lot of black market. There's like an intentional market trade, and then just community aspect of being able to buy, sell, share things under the guise of the government. So there's like a lot of books like Viet Thanh Wins, and then I'm forgetting the author's name, but of The Mountain Sings, they explicitly talk about these types of markets where people they go to their community members and say, how much did you get that bag of rice for? How much did you get something for, without asking the actual sellers, because they want to make sure that they get the right price or like the best deal on it. And so these types of rumors spread so widely. So I think that the rumor culture and just being able to share information from the sidelines is such a huge part of the social aspect of this community.
And we find sort of our social media analysis coming from the election based, particularly on election narratives, but because we've been hosting our focus groups this summer, that a lot more of our conversation has been sort of tinged by COVID, which has been really interesting in terms of figuring out this kind of diasporic flow of information for people who have a lot of family members in Vietnam. Vietnam's had a really sort of tumultuous and interesting experience with COVID because they did so well for so long, and Delta has sort of now just ripped through, and they're having to really quickly pursue this very aggressive vaccination sort of schedule to get people out of lockdown. And there's not been as much government sort of help for people who are in lockdown. They've been in lockdown since May 31st now, and it just got extended. So there's a lot of people who are really economically suffering under the lockdown. And there's that sort of intensity and vulnerability has bred certain misinformation narratives, some of which make it over here and some of which just stay in Vietnam. And we have people in our focus groups who will say, like, why would I trust, information that this, Vietnamese news person on Facebook is saying about Trump, because they're not even here, they're in Vietnam. But when it comes to COVID, it's really different because it's that kind of globalized experience. So we're seeing a few kind of different shifts depending on the nature of like the misinformation that we're looking at too.
Young Kang, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, thank you. My question is for Rachel and Sarah. Have you seen partisan asymmetry in misinformation within the Vietnamese community with regards to misinformation rumors in the 2020 election? Are there more Vietnamese who tend to vote for Trump that are more likely to believe in misinformation? That's my first question. My second question is just based on my personal experience. I have acquaintances, Chinese Americans, who voted for Trump, and I like to know why they did that. And as it turned out, there is just a very important issue within the Chinese American community. Obviously, I'm characterizing it, but I think the issue is really the affirmative action. A lot of them are actually against the affirmative action because they believe that their kids cannot get into elite universities and colleges. So it is that issue that motivated a lot of them to vote for Trump, even though they may not agree with Trump on other issues. So I wonder if this also happens within the Vietnamese community in terms of whether there are any single issue issues that may motivate them to vote for Republicans or Trump.
Yeah, I mean, most salient is just any sort of anti-Chinese sentiments coming from Vietnamese people. And that's just because of like the 1,000 years of imperialism that China had over Vietnam. And while like right now, Vietnam and China are in good relations and there's, mutual trade going on, there still is so much competition within the Southeast Asian countries and China. So one of the biggest things why a lot of Vietnamese Americans ended up voting for Trump or are more right-leaning are because of these, he was just so very vocal about being against China. But I don't, right now with our data, I can't really say that there is symmetry of partisanship of like a direct link to voters for Trump and then more belief in misinformation.
There's definitely the same sort of asymmetry when it comes to the nature of the misinformation narratives that we've collected in our data set. They are overwhelmingly sort of pro-Trump, anti-Biden misinformation narratives. Some of that I think is a consequence of they are just, the English language misinformation narratives that get translated. So we saw a lot of the same sort of ballot harvesting, ballot dumping, just translated into Vietnamese. But also, there's several that were fairly not unique to Vietnamese Americans, but as Sarah said, ones that explicitly are talking about Biden's supposed track record with voting against Vietnamese immigration to the US, stuff about BLM in particular has been, BLM is a Marxist organization. A lot of the younger people that we've spoken to have said, a lot of difficulties arose last year talking to their parents about anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. That was really difficult to have because of the misinformation that was coming around Black Lives Matter. But it definitely, Trump is a very popular figure within Vietnam because of, well, in spite of his relationship with China, but because of his sort of anti-socialism, sort of pro-patriotic sort of American stance is really attractive within Vietnam, which has just sort of cemented that sort of diasporic link of misinformation when that's happened.
I'll also add within the anti-BLM sentiments that kind of goes along the lines of what you were saying about your friend not being supporting of affirmative action, because I think there's a lot of not resentment, but then there's a lot of comparison that people do of saying that, well, we are immigrants who are very vulnerable because of the war. So why they end up going towards that all lives matter slogan, which then becomes very problematic. So there's a lot of information that they're kind of just contextualizing in their own history.
So if I might take the prerogative to ask the last question of you two. I'm really fascinated by the continued discussion about the intergenerational differences and thinking about a lot of empirical research recently that suggested that in the US context with English language misinformation, it is overwhelmingly being consumed by older Americans, older generations. And there's even some internal research that has leaked from Facebook suggesting that any sort of kind of washout, any sort of research that's showing that there aren't large effects of mis and disinformation across the population are missing the large scale impacts that are happening with older Americans. And given your conversations about intergenerational dynamics, I wonder if that's something that you're worried about in the Vietnamese context. And if any of your data so far, interviews and so on, can help elucidate any of this.
I think it's really difficult to get a sort of handle on what is happening without access to good data. And unfortunately, I think everything that's happened with Facebook in recent weeks and years has shown that they don't necessarily have good faith of working with academics, and the tools that we have, even like the CrowdTangle access that we have for now, who knows if that will continue, is a good enough insight into what conversation on their platform looks like, let alone conversation that happens on every other platform. So it does feel a little bit like we're scrambling around in the dark to try and understand this problem, which is why I think that focus groups and sort of qualitative methodology has been really useful for us as a way of like taking the kind of little nuggets that we've gained from Facebook and talking about them with people who are actually hopefully won't have seen them, but probably have seen these narratives within their own communities, both on Facebook and elsewhere. And so that's where it's sort of like this generational divide kind of cements itself within these discussions as well, not only thinking through like how are our parents or ourselves or our grandparents experiencing this information, but how do we even try and design intervention into that. We can't intervene in these spaces that they have online, but we can make interventions elsewhere, whether that's media literacy or just providing a kind of more resources to create a more competitive media environment for Vietnamese Americans to explore. But I'm not sure what the answer is. Like the generational divide feels like such a sort of stopping point as well. There's a lot of familial tensions, kind of cultural familial practices that, it's the same thing happens in all families, that you dismiss the younger ones for not knowing enough about a topic, or you're young, you'll change your mind later, or there's certain sort of courtesies you want to give to all the generations that might mean that you're not going to challenge the information that they present to you in different ways. And I'm really not sure how we get around that. Sarah, do you know? Can you solve that?
Yeah, this is such a great point. Thank you for bringing it up. I think just in this, since we are still in the beginning of this project and this research, one of the things that we're emphasizing on and that we're starting to partner with CTAP is just getting the conversation and discourse going within the family members and in the community. Because for so long, within these past 30 years, the trauma and the historical experiences have been ignored and invisibilized because people don't want to bring it up. And with this new resurgence of the younger generation, like my sisters and myself actually willing to bring this up with our parents in the household versus like being scared of that conflict, empowering these people to actually bring it up, I think is such a huge part of the start of it. Because the dinner table, just being home with family, is so big, especially during these COVID times where intergenerational households are so much more salient now. So one of the things that we're doing is not even just starting the discussion within these focus groups or within the interviews, but then getting these research like researchers in our collective to start thinking about it as well, and showing them that this is something that you can do within your day-to-day, and it's not just going to be a one-off in your family that people won't care about. And then with CTAP, they're doing this project about oral history, so really bringing the conversation between generations and then making it so that it becomes a part of an archive. So I think just like encouraging people to have that discourse in the first step is already so big, and then we can hopefully use that data for something else.
Amazing. I mean, I think this is a perfect kind of end to the discussion, because it, again, just drives home the powerful impacts and potential that this work really has. So I'm so excited on behalf of IDDP. I'm so excited that we've been able to help support the work. And I'm really, really, really excited to see where you go from here. So thank you. Thanks to everyone who was able to join us in the audience. Thanks in particular to those who asked really insightful questions. And we will be reaching out and in touch about our next sessions as well. So much more to hear from the other fellows from IDDP's Research Fellowship Program as well. All right, have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.